Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Welcome back to Horror Analysis. With me, Drew. Hi there. Today we're continuing with History of Horror, and we're going to start to wrap up History of Horror as well, which is kind of cool. We are in the section 1800 to 1824. After this, I'm pretty much going to have I think I'm going to do one chapter for the entire 1700s, because basically we're just playing with the 1790s and early and late 1780s, and then we're doing the stuff before that. Well, maybe a little bit in the 1700s as well. Daniel Defoe and Smollett, I gotta go over a bit. But other than that, and then it's the stuff before that. So I'll do 1700s, and then I'll do the pre-1700s. The early horror stuff. Quasi-horror. Yeah. So, let's see. Today we're going 1800 to 1824. It's an interesting time. As I mentioned before, Frankenstein's in here. There's quite a few. E.T.A. Hoffman, Christabel, etc., etc., etc. There's quite a bit. Did I want to go? I think I want to go in reverse chronological order, or I might not. See, this is what we have here. This is a mix. Of course, we're still playing with Shill. Supernatural Horror and Literature by H.P. Lovecraft. We've pretty much done away. Of course, modern masters are far, far gone. Far in the future from what we're talking about now. Far in the past from what we did. The sections on weird tradition is gone too. We're past that stuff. No more weird traditions. We are all in, well, these 2 pages of notes. Yeah, that's not right. Did I have that on my list? Because it shouldn't be on my list. Good. Sorry. I just wanted to make sure that I didn't put that down, because that's tomorrow's or next videos. Yes. So, This is more stuff that influenced other stuff. With the exception of Frankenstein, which of course we've mentioned about 40 times before. This is not for the exception of that. There's not stuff that most people know. Oh, what the heck, I'll go in chronological order. Let's start Anne Radcliffe. We're going to be talking more about Anne Radcliffe. She is featured in Lovecraft's section called Early Gothic. The Early Gothic, what is it called? Is it just called the Early Gothic? The Early Gothic novel, yeah. Her last one, written in 1802. In fact, it wasn't published till after her death in 1826, but since it's written in 1802, we're going to call it 1802. Pardon me. Well, hot water is very hot. We're going to talk more about her stuff in the next video. The Radcliffean, he actually uses Radcliffean, I think, as a Radcliffean to describe other people. Actually, some things of Poe. Poe was influenced by Radcliffe, apparently. Or things of Poe, or what is it? Come on now. Now that I have to know. Um, oh, okay. Contrasting Poe with Radcliffe. So, the hero of the Poe story is not the diabolical villain of a Radcliffean novel. Radcliffean. Um, in this one, it's a guy gets about to get married. I did look it up on Wikipedia. It's not one I've read. And a guy comes in and says, "You killed my kinsman." They go to trial. The abbot is trying to cover up the truth. The ghosts are trying to expose the truth. And, you know, when you have ghosts playing around doing stuff, you have at least a nominal horror tale. May not be. It's this early Gothic stuff. There's a lot of ghosts after truth or after revenge or after whatever. Yeah. So, I guess note for next video. Speaking of ghosts, I gotta remember if I'm doing 1700s next time. Well, early before 1700s, I gotta put in Shakespeare someplace in there, because Schill doesn't really talk about Shakespeare. 17th century. Pardon me. Yeah, so Anne Radcliffe. We'll discuss her more. I don't think this is not even a story that Lovecraft really mentions all that often in any way, shape, or form. Yeah, he doesn't really mention any of the other ones. He mentions Udolpho, which I'll talk about when we're in the 1790s. Charles Robert Maturin, one of the two people in the section called the apex of the Gothic novel. Is it apex? The apex of Gothic romance. Gregory Lewis is mentioned. We'll talk about him when we're talking about the 1790s, because 1790s was the next section. And then there's Robert Charles Maturin. The first one, Fatal Revenge or Family of Montorio, is 1807, so that's why he's in the chronological order. He calls it one confused Radcliffean imitation, which is the Fatal Revenge or the Family of Montorio, and the other one is Melmoth the Wanderer. I tried to get through Melmoth, or I did get through Melmoth. I'm not sure which. It got weird. On LibriVox, it's the free audiobook version. It's available then. I could have swore... I know I started it. I don't know... I don't think I got through it. It's essentially... a man has to wander the earth until he finds someone who will trade places with him. He's doomed, he's damned to wander the earth until some poor sap will trade places with him, and he's been doing it for a long time. And he tries to go to people dying cancer and whatnot, or dying of some disease, horrible disease. It says, "Trade places with me. You live and I won't." And they won't do it because he's damned. Later, Balzac really liked it, and he wrote a sequel to it, where he finds someone who will trade with him, in a madhouse or something. Was it? I don't think Lovecraft mentions the Balzac story, but Honore de Balzac we've mentioned before. Not last video, maybe a video before that. So Melmoth the Wanderer, definitely one of the big names in horror fiction from this time. Probably in Lovecraft's view, the biggest name, with maybe the exception of Frankenstein. Maybe Christabel. Goethe actually might have the Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Faust Part 1, 1808. We're going to talk about him more next time, because I much prefer Der Erlkönig poem. Well, I've been trying to... wrong buttons. I've been trying to save poetry for its own video. I'm hoping to still save poetry for its own video, so I'm saving Der Erlkönig and Demon of the Gibbet, and even Christabel, I guess, deserves that in there in rhyme. We're going to talk about Coleridge because he's on there. So, yeah. But Goethe wrote Faust, or wrote his version of Faust. Of course, Faust keeps popping up over and over again. Guy sells his soul to Mephistopheles, the agent of the devil, some demon, for knowledge of everything, and then tries to get out of it to save his soul. Part 2 is when he does get out of it to save his soul. But from what everybody seems to say, I have, again, one is on my list, I haven't read it. Full disclosure there. One is where the suspenseful stuff is. But Goethe is definitely a big name. There are big names in here. Shelley, Polidori, Keats, Hugo. Hugo's huge. Coleridge is huge. Hoffman is huge. Hoffman's big. Goethe's huge. I'm not trying to knock Hoffman. I'm not trying to knock any of the names I didn't mention either, but there's some big names on here. This is just, they don't, Hugo only did one real horror story that Lovecraft thought was worth mentioning, and it's the one at the end here, which we'll talk about. Goethe wrote, he was called a polymath according to Wikipedia. He wrote science stuff, he wrote poetry, he wrote novels. Basically, the two that ring out as horror or supernatural at all are, Der Erlkönig and Faust. So, yeah, Faust part 1 was during this time. Friedrich Heinrich Karl de la Motte Fock wrote Undine in 1811. Actually, Lovecraft does spend some time with this one. About half a page anyway. Almost a full page. In his Aftermath, Spectral Literature on the Continent. Undine is the daughter of a powerful water prince. Was exchanged by her father for a small child as a fisherman's daughter, so she's a changeling sort of idea. And then has to make someone fall in love with her before she dies. Am I getting this confused with something else? No, this is just getting weirder. I am getting it confused with something else. Weird. I won't do the spoiler. I won't read out the whole section. I shouldn't have been reading it on camera anyway, but whatever. So, skipping that. Undine is one that Lovecraft will be talking about quite extensively. It's kind of a changeling-esque, it's kind of a supernatural suspense story. James Hogg, we've talked about before. Kilmeny is the one that Lovecraft wants to talk about on page 23, which means it's the early Gothic section. That was 1813. I had some information on that, didn't I? Kilmeny. Ghostly charm of James Hogg's Kilmeny. That's all he says about it. Did I have more information that I forgot? You know what? That is quite possible. Dang it. Kilmeny. Did I read over the... Did I read over the section and on Wikipedia? I got nothing, do I? No. Oh well, alright. Ghostly charm of Kilmeny. I had the date. I guess I had this on here. And the other one, of course, that we talked about in the section on the Fantastic was Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner, where if you read it one way, it's a guy goes crazy, kills his parents, his girlfriend, his girlfriend's mom. And if you read it another way, there's a what's the word? Doppelganger involved. So it's either huge religious fanaticism or a doppelganger. Yeah. So we talked about that before in the Fantastic section. Oh, and then we get to E.T.A. Hoffmann, which is cool, because I like E.T.A. Hoffmann. Der Sandman, read as, in Nachtstück. I don't know what that translates to. Night something. I'm not up on my German. He's the big German fantasist of this time period. I think he died in 1822. So, Sandman is where a guy is scared of the Sandman because the Sandman takes the eyes out of children who aren't sleeping, plucks them out, and they have to, they're and he thinks the Sandman is friends with his dad. And then he grows up and he still thinks that the guy's. He meets somebody who reminds him of the Sandman when he's trying to get married, and it all comes back to him and stuff. Yeah. It's actually one of the bases for the Sandman as Neil Gaiman wrote it in his graphic novels. If Wikipedia is not lying. Which, you never know. The other one, of course, is Nussknacker und Mauskönig, which is the Nutcracker and the Mouse King. It's where the Nutcracker comes from. And depending on your version of the ballet of the Nutcracker, of course, it can get pretty creepy with the mice. It could be pretty goofy too, depending on the version. As the story goes, it's not as suspenseful. But Hoffman is known as a fantasist. It's not supposed to be horror. It's supposed to be fantasy that gets dark on occasion. As we mentioned before, Lovecraft's definition of horror is even more restrictive than, Noel Carroll's definition of horror. King might call some versions of the Nutcracker, hey, pretty scary, pretty horrific. Or at least, creepy. He's the most admissive, the most inclusive. Oh, actually, speaking of King, is that next? No. Close, though. Actually, just about next. Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote Christabel. Well, he wrote it in 1797 and 1800. It was published in 1816. The first two parts. He never wrote more than two parts. He was supposed to be a 5-parter. But you get if you read the first two parts of Christabel, you get where the story's going to go. It's telegraphed. You basically don't need the other 3 parts. You know what's going to happen. And it's creepy. And it's good. I recommend it. It's a poem. So again, I'm going to talk about it more. Basically, I'm only going to talk about 3 when I talk about horror poetry, because I don't know much about other horror poetry besides Christabel, Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which I guess is number 4, which have horror elements. The Earl King, and Demon of the Gibbet. Oh, actually, Lovecraft did some poetry. Maybe I'm not going to go over some of it, because some of it's just ridiculous. The really racist one was a poem, and that was just awful. But he did do... Am I thinking of somebody else? Oh, shoot. That's another video anyway, so I'm skipping that for the time being. But Christabel was written during this time, and Christabel was read at what Stephen King calls the maddest tea party. What did he call it? The maddest tea party ever? The maddest English tea party? The maddest British tea parties of all time. One of the maddest British tea parties of all time. Because it was attended by the next 2 guys. Mary Shelley, her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, their buddy, Lord Byron, and Lord Byron's doctor and friend, at the time anyway. They fell out afterwards. John Polidori. They were reading ghost stories in Geneva. And they read, actually, some of Christabel. And actually, I'm going to read what King's version of this, because this is pretty good. They're reading a book called German Ghost Stories, called Phantasmagoria. There we go. And the gathering began to get decidedly weird. Things culminated when Percy Shelley threw a kind of fit. Dr. Polidori noted in his diary, "After tea, 12 o'clock, really began to talk ghosts. Lord Byron read some verses of Coleridge's Christabel, the part about the witch's breasts, when silence ensued. Shelley, suddenly shrinking and putting his hands to his head, ran out of the room with a candle, threw water in his face and gave him ether. He was looking at Mrs. Shelley and suddenly thought of a woman he had heard of who had eyes instead of nipples, which, taking hold of his mind, horrified him." Leave it to the English, so says Stephen King. Yeah, leave it to the English on that one. Eyes instead of nipples. So, they decided, the two Shelleys, Byron and Polidori, said, let's all write a ghost story to rival these ones in Phantasmagoria. I'll say it right one of these days. Like, as good as Christabel, or better. So they sat down and tried to write it. Shelley wrote a little thing about someone being buried alive and gave up on it after a while. Byron wrote a little bit of a fragment that he gave up on as well. Polidori, if you want to buy this, stole the fragment that Byron wrote and turned it into his own book story. I'm not sure. You could read both back to back and decide for yourself. That's all I'm saying. And, of course, Mary Shelley, during this time, wrote the first version of Frankenstein, which was very cut down. Actually, I'd really like to read that first version. I don't know if it survives or not. And then was later fleshed out into a book, the regular Frankenstein version that we all know, and some of us love. I'm not really crazy about it myself. I think it's too long. It should be shorter. Personal preference, maybe. Or maybe I just had to sit through this guy's version of it and I really didn't like the reader. That guy. I just don't like the reader. But, you know, maybe it's the book. I can't tell for sure. I got the impression that I was very certain that she was married to a poet when I read the book. That's the impression I got. It was, yeah. Anyway, but as far as influence goes, no one's denying that Frankenstein had a huge influence on horror. Frankenstein stories that are not by Mary Shelley, of course, I really like. I've talked about all of those before. I'm not going to talk about them again. And then we have Polidori's The Vampire, which King wants to say that out of the two tarot cards, because he's talking about Tales of the Tarot here, he wants to say that two tarot cards came out of the same British Tea Party, because the vampire was an influence on Dracula. It was one of the first vampire as living dead things, blood drinkers, blood killer things out there. Yeah. So, and as we talked about, we have the vampire, and then you go into the one I talked about. Oh, what was the one last time? I'll have to look that up. The one last time where it was the first use of holy water as a deterrent to vampires. And then you go into Carmilla by, pardon me, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu. And then you go into Dracula as the codification of the vampire, I don't want to say mythos, but the tarot card. The tarot card is codified by Dracula, but it's, Dracula was influenced by Carmilla. Carmilla was influenced by the one I can't remember. I'll think of it. Or maybe it's on here. No, maybe it's not. Yeah, I don't remember it. And that was influenced by Polydores the Vampire. Going on, actually, and then we go into the John Keats. There's a lot of spillover between Keats and Shelley, Percy Shelley. And then at Keats' funeral, actually, there was a woman at Keats' funeral called Sheridan Le Fanu, and I can't figure out which Sheridan Le Fanu it is, because there's about 3 famous women in Sheridan Le Fanus, and possibly more that aren't famous. I think it's Sheridan Le Fanu's grandmother, which was at Keats's funeral. But anyway, Lamia was... Where am I at? I'm on page 23. Lamia was a poem by Keats. Actually, sort of a... he mentions many of Keats's poems border on cosmic horror. No wonder I like him so much. I've never noticed the cosmic horrorness of some of his poems. Maybe I need to read some more of them, which I'm okay with because I really like Keats. Lamia. That's not one I'm familiar with either, but more restrained approaches to cosmic horror in Lamia and many of Keats' other poems, for exact quote. Right. So John Keats, also in this section, huge name. And then we go to Victor Hugo in 1823. One of his first books was Hans of Iceland. Actually, what does he say about Hans of Iceland? I think it's a section of Hans of Iceland that he talks about. No, he doesn't mention anything. He just mentions that Hans of Iceland is a example of this sort of spectral literature on the continent. So not a whole lot, but it is on the list. Wikipedia actually didn't have any information on Hans of Iceland, and I don't think I found anything else online either. Last time I checked. Unfortunately. Maybe I'll put that on my list. Of course, later on, Victor Hugo went on to write other things but while not being horror, when it became movie time, when movies were being made, they went for horrific makeup. I'm thinking of Hunchback of Notre Dame, of course, which was 20 years after this one. And then when Hunchback was first put into movie form, they did it with horrific makeup. Actually, I think one of the first female director, the one that broke the minute mark and then did other stuff, she did the first version of Hunchback. Kind of cool. Just saying. It's not necessarily horror. It's not as a book anyway. But when it got to movie times, the makeup artists, of course, are going to play a big part in the movies. So it's worth a mention, if nothing else. Hans of Iceland, I don't have any info on. I wish I did. Pardon me. I wish I did. Yeah, so we're almost done with History of Horror. Once I get through it, I'm going to do a couple recaps going chronologically. Just a quick to catch you up. Hey, this influenced this, who influenced this, who influenced this. I'm being more listy because, of course, Lovecraft is listy. So I'm going through, pages of lists that Lovecraft has, and then when I'm going forward on it, I'll just get the notable ones, the stuff, what influenced what, and who influenced who, and who was a big influence on this guy, who was a big influence on this guy, who was a big influence on this guy. I might do 1 or 2 videos like that as well. Definitely 1, maybe 2. So, I'm going to continue with History of Horror next time. I shall do the 1700s all in one big video. It's not even going to be a big video. This was only 37 minutes at the moment. And I don't think it's going to be much more than that for the whole of the 1700s. Pardon me. And another short section for the whole of the everything before 1700s. So, yeah. Coming down to that, of course, then we get to play around with other stuff like horror anthropology, which I'm really looking forward to. At the beginning of this series, I had enough for 1 horror anthropology video. Now I have enough for 3. So I'm really looking forward to that. I have a lot of notes to go over, but it should be cool. And then non-narrative history, non-narrative horror, rather. Which I'm hoping to talk about, well, horror poetry, horror music, horror theater, horror, which includes horror opera, horror ballet. Maybe I'll talk about the Nutcracker some more. Horror games, both video and tabletop. What else did I have? Horror music, horror painting, horror sculpture, of course. Ooh, I gotta do some more research on that. I'm falling behind on that bit. But that'll be fun. I'm looking forward to that. Yeah. So, I think we're over the halfway point, folks. I think we've been over the halfway point, but I'm just now realizing that we're over the halfway point. Right. Cool. So next time, more History of Horror. My name's Drew. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on Horror Analysis. Have a great night. And, well, these 2 pages of notes. Yeah, that's not right. Did I have that on my list? Because it shouldn't be on my list. Good. Sorry. I just wanted to make sure that I didn't put that down, because that's tomorrow's or next videos. Yes. So, this is more stuff that influenced other stuff. With the exception of Frankenstein, which of course we've mentioned about 40 times before. This is not for the exception of that. There's not stuff that most people know. Defoe and Smollett. I gotta go over a bit. But other than that, and then it's the stuff before that. So I'll do 1700s, and then I'll do the pre-1700s, the early horror stuff, quasi-horror. Yeah. So let's see. Today we're going 1800 to 1824. It's an interesting time. As I mentioned before, Frankenstein's in here. There's quite a few. E.T.A. Hoffman, Christabel, etc., etc., etc. There's quite a bit. Did I want to go? I think I want to go in reverse. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Welcome back to Horror Analysis. With me, Drew. Hi there. Today we're continuing with History of Horror, and we're going to start to wrap up History of Horror as well, which is kind of cool. We are in the section 1800 to 1824. After this, I'm pretty much going to have I think I'm going to do one chapter for the entire 1700s, because basically we're just playing with the 1790s and early and late 1780s, and then we're doing the stuff before that. Well, maybe a little bit in the 1700s as well. Daniel, reverse chronological order, or I might not. See, this is what we have here. This is a mix. Of course, we're still playing with Shill, Supernatural Horror and Literature by H.P. Lovecraft. We've pretty much done away. Of course, modern masters are far, far gone. Far in the future from what we're talking about now. Far in the past from what we did. The sections on weird tradition is gone too. We're past that stuff. Yeah, no more weird traditions. We are all in. Oh, what the heck? I'll go in chronological order. Let's start. Anne Radcliffe. We're going to be talking more about Anne Radcliffe. She is featured in Lovecraft's section called Early Gothic. The Early Gothic. What is it called? Is it just called the Early Gothic? The Early Gothic novel. Yeah. Her last one, written in 1802. In fact, it wasn't published till after her death in 1826, but since it's written in 1802, we're going to call it 1802.